Joe Gibbs will not allow Christopher Bell to run dirt races. Rockingham has had brief conversations about a possible return to NASCAR, and NASCAR teams want to keep the charter system permanent with some different perks. What's going on, guys? It's Daniel, and welcome back to our video. We got a ton of NASCAR and other motorsports stories here today on the channel. Let's go ahead and just jump straight into those really quickly. We're going to start talking about Advent Health, as it was announced on Wednesday that Advent Health is going to sponsor Ross Chastain in 2023 for 6 races. Advent Health has been a big partner of Ross Chastain's for the last couple of years, and also a big part of Chip Ganassi Racing when they were around. Really glad to see they're continuing partnering Trackhouse in 2023, and the car looks really awesome, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about the Clash purse money. As every single time we have a race, Bob Poggers puts out the purse money for the Clash. And the purse money for the Clash this year is $2,085,000. Really glad to see that that's the purse money. I think that's more than last year's purse money, if I'm not mistaken. So very happy to see that is going to be the purse money for 2023. And I think that's some pretty good purse money for the Clash in 2023. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Fire Depot Coffee. As it was announced yesterday, that Fire Depot Coffee is going to sponsor Kaz Grala for 10 races in 2023. Fire Depot Coffee, I believe, has sponsored Kaz Grala in the past, if I'm not mistaken, so really glad to see that they're going to be joining Kaz Grala once again for 10 races. Happy to see that they're returning to sponsor in 2023. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Celsius. As Celsius, it was announced, is going to continue sponsoring Kaulig Racing in 2023 for multiple races. In fact, Celsius, I believe, is going to be sponsoring AJ Allmendinger, or I believe it's Justin Haley, if I'm not mistaken, this weekend at the Busch Light Clash. Really excited to see the Celsius continues their partnership. They're sponsoring a lot of drivers this year in 2023. They're sponsoring Corey LaJoie. They're sponsoring Live Fast Motorsports and BJ McLeod this season. So really glad to see Celsius will continue their partnership. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Trophy Tractor. As it was announced yesterday, that Trophy Tractor is going to sponsor Garrett Smithley for multiple races in 2023. Trophy Tractor has been a loyal partner of Garrett Smithley for the last couple years, so no shock and surprise that they are going to continue sponsoring Garrett Smithley. Excited to see the paint scheme when it does come out. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about JTG Doherty Racing. As JTG Doherty Racing has announced all of their 2023 partners. Some of those partners include Kroger, Coca-Cola, Reese's, and Hershey's. There's going to be a lot of different paint schemes this year for JTG Doherty. It's probably like 20 to 25 paint schemes this year, just of how many partners they have this year. But I'm glad to see that they've announced a lot of partners, once again, for the 2023 season. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about LoJack. It was reported by Adam Stern yesterday that LoJack is going to be joining Hendrick Motorsports as an associate partner for the next 3 years, which will go through the 2025 season. LoJack has been part of the Hendrick Automotive Group for a very long time, so it isn't really a big shock or surprise that LoJack is going to be joining up to sponsor them once again in 2023. Glad to see that they are going to be joining. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Quaker State. As expected, Quaker State is going to be joining Trackhouse Racing in 2023. It's unclear if they're going to have any primaries or just be an associate sponsor, but Quaker State's been rumored for a while they were going to join Trackhouse Racing, so it's really good to see that they actually are going to be joining in 2023. Glad to see that they are joining, and happy that they'll be joining in 2023. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about scanners. As it was reported by Tim Clark, who's a higher-up executive at NASCAR, that scanners are only going to be available on PC in 2023. Other type of things like prepaid stuff I think is no longer going to be available, but I'm glad at least that they're going to be keeping scanners on PC. Also, the onboard cameras they have for the playoffs last year for all the drivers, those are all returning next year as well, which I think is a really good thing. So at least there's some positives for sure, but scanners are back in 2023. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Legacy Motor Club. As Legacy Motor Club has made some pretty big executive changes for 2023. The most notable are Bruce Mosley is going to be president of business operations, and Joey Cohan, who used to be a crew chief for Legacy Motor Club, will be the vice president of racing operations. Jimmy's, I think, making some of these executive changes to really help Legacy Motor Club for the better. The hope is that they can become a much better organization in 2023 than were last year, though they did show some really good signs last year. So it's a pretty big executive change going into 2023. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about the Chicago Street Course. As the stage lengths have all been revealed for every single series for the Cup Series, Xfinity Series, and Truck Series. We kind of talked about us on the channel a couple months ago when they were actually revealed. I think they're revealed back in December or November, if I'm not mistaken. And we now know the stage length for the Chicago Street Course. It is going to be 100 laps long. That is going to be a pretty long race. It's going to be one of the longer road course races of the year for sure. At least there's going to be no stage cautions for the Cup Series and the Xfinity Series, which at least that's a positive. So maybe not as much chaos, but it might create a lot of chaos for the event. But that is going to be how long the race is. 100 laps, I think, is a little bit too long for the street course race, but that is just my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about pre-race meetings. As pre-race driver meetings are coming back in 2023. There have not really been a lot of pre-race meetings in the last couple years due to the pandemic, but they are returning in the 1948 style, which I think is really, really good. Going back to the 75th anniversary, I love that they're going to the old style, basically 10-minute meetings with the 1948 style. I think that's a really cool thing that they're doing is going back to that style for 2023. I think that's really, really exciting news overall. I think it's big for the sport in general, and glad to say that they are going to be doing that for the 2023 edition. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about the FIA. As it was reported by Andrew Benson and multiple F1 reporters that the FIA has launched application process for new Formula One teams. One of the big reasons I think that this has been launched is so that we could potentially see teams like Andretti come into play. Andretti is trying to get into Formula One currently at the moment, but basically the F1 teams have not been budging. And we know the FIA, though, people like Mohammed bin Suleiman and people in the industry really want teams like Andretti to come into play and be part of Formula One because it would be really, really big for the sport, especially with how many people from the United States have been watching Formula One as of recently. They really want to bring those people in. And I think it really needs to happen where we can see teams like Andretti approved because I think it'd be really big for the sport in general if they can end up getting approved overall. So I think it's a really good cool application process they're doing, and let's hope that we can maybe see some new Formula One teams in the future, including teams like Andretti. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about the Indy 500. As was reported by Nathan Brown from the Indy Star, that IndyCar has ditched awarding double points for the Indy 500. They've been awarding double points for the Indy 500 since basically I think every year since 2014. The last year they did not award double points for the Indy 500. I think goes all the way back to 2013, so nearly 10 years since the last time that happened. I think what they're trying to do is make the championship a little bit more fair. I know the Indy 500 is the biggest event. They don't want the Indy 500 though completely deciding the championship and basically making a driver be a championship threat if they haven't really been a championship threat all year. I think it is a very interesting move, though. They're not going to be doing that this year. I think it's very interesting, and it's a move that I kind of am a little bit surprised they're doing, but at the same token, same time, I completely understand why they have gone ahead and decided to do that. So very interesting move regardless, and it's a very interesting move for sure. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Garage 56. Now, over the last couple of days, Garage 56 car has been testing at Daytona International Speedway, and one thing you notice is headlights. Of course, Garage 56 is going to be competing at the Le Mans 24 Hours in 2023 once it does get approved by the ACO, which it's likely going to get approved by the ACO. That's one thing that is expected. But one thing, like I mentioned, headlights on a NASCAR Cup Series car or a NASCAR car in general. I never thought it would be the day where they'd be on there, but I don't think it's ever been on a NASCAR car before, except maybe back when they ran at Le Mans in the past. That being said, though, I think this is a really cool addition. I think it is a really exciting regardless, and it's really cool to see that they are going to be having that for the move. I think it's really exciting and really big for sure. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about injured drivers. Now, it was reported by Bob Pockers, I believe, on Wednesday, that if a driver gets out of the car injured, the replacement cannot get them into the playoffs. What that means is that, like I said, if a driver gets into the car that basically, did not start the race, if a driver leaves the car early, has to leave the car early, the driver gets in the car cannot get that person in the playoffs, meaning you can't have replacement drivers because you can see some teams potentially exploit this rule. This prevents drivers getting in basically on replacement side of things, which I think overall is a really good move in general. So I do like this move overall, and I think it's very interesting, though, regardless. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about vehicles on pit road. Now, we kind of talk about, I didn't really talk much about the orange pit box rule, but NASCAR is going to be having orange pit boxes and orange pit boxes so that drivers, if they go past that, they can get big penalties. There was a diagram that I think it was revealed by Bob Pockersing, put out basically saying that if a driver interferes with a pit stop, it could result in a pretty massive penalty. Basically, they don't want drivers getting hurt on pit road, and it could be very dangerous if a driver ends up doing something really erratic on pit road. So they want to basically avoid having a situation where that could actually come into play, which I think overall is a really good move for everybody, and I think it is a good move overall. They've done this. I think it should be maybe one race suspension for the move or massive fines or massive point penalties, because I think a driver should honestly get suspended because you don't want that kind of stuff happening on pit road. So overall, I think this is a really, really good move. In general, I think it's a good move. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about CR7 Motorsports. As a couple days ago on Wednesday evening or Thursday morning, CR7 Motorsports basically went out and put out a picture showing and teasing their 2023 plans. CR7 Motorsports is expected to return in 2023. The driver that's been rumored from what I heard is Colby Howard, if I'm not mistaken, is a driver that is expected to drive the car, but that has not been confirmed at this moment. But he is likely going to be the driver of that CR7 truck in 2023. We'll see what happens. He's a driver that's expected, but it's really good to see, though, they're going to be bringing him into the team. I think Colby's a very talented driver. I know that last year didn't go fantastic. I think he drove for McAnally Hilgeman last year and had some pretty solid runs with the team last year, but lost his right. But CR7 maybe is a little bit of a downgrade, but at the same token, same time, I want to see him end up getting in the ride and performing well, and I hope he does perform well with the team if he does end up going to the team in 2023. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Glory to God Racing. As reported by TobyChristie.com yesterday, that Glory to God Racing is going to be entering the Truck Series once again in 2023. Johnny Sauter expected to drive the 47 truck in the Daytona opener, and Tim Veen's expected to drive the 46 truck. The 47 truck is expected to run the full season. Now, it's unclear what other drivers are going to drive that 47 truck in the 2023 season, but we know for sure that Johnny Sauter is going to drive it. Now, Johnny Sauter did run for the team last year in 2022. He's supposed to run like 10 or 11 races with the team, but basically left the team early. I think it's because he got frustrated with the performance because, let's be honest and for real, G2G Racing was really, really bad last year, and they're under a lot of fire and had a lot of issues. But overall, I think it's good to see that they are returning, though I think they're not the greatest team overall, and they're a team that's been kind of known for making a lot of bad decisions overall. That being said, though, I hope they can perform. It'd be good to see them actually perform, and we'll see what happens in 2023, but in general, glad to see that they are going to be returning in 2023. And now we're going ahead on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Jade Buford. As it was announced yesterday that Jade Buford is going to drive the 5 for Big Machine Racing at Daytona. This will be the only time I believe this season that they're going to run the 5 car as of now. Jade Buford, of course, has been a driver of Big Machine Racing in the past. Ran a lot of road course races in the number 48 car and was supposed to run the full season in 2022. But unfortunately, did not perform really, really great with the team last year. But this is like another second chance opportunity for him to perform, and it's a good opportunity for Jay Buford. I think he almost won the pole for this race, if I'm not mistaken, in 2022, which was really, really impressive. Or qualified up front. I think he qualified on the front row last year in this event. So I think in general does have a really good chance and a really good shot to win the pole overall for the event, maybe overall win the race, which would be really, really surprising. But it's good to see that they're going to be entering a second car in 2023. I think he's got an easy, good shot to get in the field. Big Machine shows the pace and speed. Plus, they got Parker Clearman coming in, which he knows how to get it done on super speedways. He's won a couple truck super speedway races, and Parker could be a favorite to win the Daytona opener for 2023. But glad to see, though, that we're going to see a second Big Machine Racing car. Maybe we'll see this car run more with other drivers, but we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about NBM Motorsports. As Bob Pockers reported yesterday, and basically answering a fan's question, NBM Motorsports is not going to be entering the 2023 Daytona 500. Now, there have been some possibility that they were going to enter the 2023 Daytona 500, but basically, it's not really that surprising, to be honest. NBM Motorsports did enter a select number of races in 2022. They did enter the Daytona 500, but both their cars ended up failing to qualify. They ran at Talladega. They also ran at Coda, and they ran a couple other races as well, but they didn't run a lot last year. And I think a big reason why NBM is not entering the 2023 Daytona 500 is because there is a lot of competitive cars trying to qualify for the 2023 Daytona 500, which you're going to have a lot of teams entering this year. There's expected around 43 to 44 cars, and most of the cars entering the Daytona 500 are going to be really, really competitive. And NBM, no disrespect to them, but they have not been the most competitive team overall in Cup. So I think that they were going to have a very difficult time to make the show, and I think that's a big reason why they have decided to not enter the 2023 Daytona 500. It is disappointing, though, regardless if they're not entering the 2023 Daytona 500, but overall, it is disappointing, and I hope they do enter some races in 2023. I would think maybe Timmy Hill gets an opportunity, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. But again, regardless, so it is very disappointing to see that NBM Motorsports is not going to be entering the 2023 Daytona 500. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Red Bull. As it was officially confirmed this morning and reported yesterday that Red Bull is going to be joining Ford in 2026. That's right, for the first time I think since 2002, Ford is going to be in Formula One in partnering with Red Bull. This is not a surprise. This actually has been expected for a while now that this was going to end up happening, where they were going to be joining Formula One. It's been reported now for really the last month this was expected, but it was officially confirmed today that's going to be happening in 2026. Honda's contract with Red Bull currently goes to the 2025 year. I would also expect, unless AlphaTauri does leave the partnership with Red Bull, I would also expect that AlphaTauri Racing is going to also switch over to Ford since they are the sister team. They're going to switch over. This is really, really huge for Formula One in a lot of big ways, though, because it could help American growth. I think this is huge. You got an American-based engine coming into play, and this could, like I said, could really grow Formula One in a lot of big and massive ways overall, which, like I said, I think is overall huge in general that they are going to be bringing him back and coming into Formula One, which I think overall is really, really huge for the sport and really, really massive. So exciting to see for sure. They're going to be entering Formula One once again in 2026. Got a couple more years. They're going to develop the engine. They also revealed the car for 2023, which I think it looks pretty solid overall. That being said, though, very exciting to see that they are going to be entering Formula One once again in 2026. It's been expected, but it's officially going to happen. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Derek Kraus. As it was announced on Wednesday evening that Derek Kraus is going to drive the 20 for Young's Motorsports in 2023 at Daytona International Speedway. Now, it's unclear how many races Derek Kraus is going to drive the number 20 truck, but he'll at least run at Daytona. It's unclear, though, how many races he'll run. This is a really big downgrade for Derek Kraus. I know it's at Daytona, but I kind of do feel a little bad for Derek Kraus because I know that Derek Kraus didn't perform absolutely great at McAnally-Hilgeman, but he still was contending for the playoffs every single year. No disrespect to Young's Motorsports because the team has shown some promise in the past, but I know it's only at Daytona, and they've won races at Daytona and Talladega in the past. Well, Talladega, really, but I just think it's a really big downgrade for Derek Kraus going into the season. I'm not a big fan of him getting in the truck. Now, maybe he gets an opportunity with a top-tier team. Maybe he goes to KBM for a race or two, which there still are races available for KBM, so that could be a possibility for Derek Kraus later down the road. But this is a big downgrade for Derek Kraus. A lot of it does matter with sponsorship funding, but there weren't a lot of really competitive rides available. But I would really love for him to get an opportunity to be in a top-tier ride. No disrespect to Young's Motorsports, but this is not the greatest organization in the world, and they've not been the fastest organization in the past. So, disappointing news for sure. Derek Kraus is not going to be running a full season, but I'm glad at least he does have somewhat of a ride in 2023. I hope he can perform with the team. I think he will be able to make the show, and I think that Derek Kraus could be a threat in the race if he is still in contention near the end of the race at Daytona. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Kyle Sieg. As it was announced Wednesday morning that Kyle Sieg is going to drive for RSS Racing in 2023 on a full-time basis in the number 28 car. This has been rumored for a while. He was potentially going to go full-time with the team, but I'm very happy to see that Kyle Sieg will be driving. I think Kyle Sieg is a very talented driver. He's not as good as his brother Ryan was, but Kyle is also a very young driver. I think Kyle's my age. I think he's 22 or 23 years old. So Kyle is a young driver who has a lot of potential to perform and do really, really good. And he had some pretty solid performances last year, I think. He was competing for maybe some top 20s and maybe some top 15s in that 28 car, which is pretty impressive, all things considered. Now, I'm not expecting going into this year that I'm not expecting Kyle Sieg to come in here and win a bunch of races this year. I'm not expecting him to go out and win a lot. But I do think that Kyle Sieg will have some pretty good performances next year, and I think this year, and I think he will do a very solid job in that number 28 car. If you want my prediction on how Kyle Sieg performs, I think Kyle Sieg will go ahead and end up basically getting some top 20s, maybe some top 15s, and maybe an occasional top 10 if the 28 car is up to snuff and shows some speed. But I think he finishes top 20 in points. I think he does a very solid job, though there's a lot of competition this year, and it's going to be a really competitive field in Xfinity. There's a lot of drivers competing this year. There could be a lot more that have not been announced at this time that could run full-time this year. But I'm excited, though, to see that Kyle Sieg is going full-time with the team in 2023. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Denny Hamlin. Now, Denny Hamlin, of course, has a new show on Dirty Mo Media, and Denny Hamlin basically asked, and there was a video that was posted by Dirty Mo Media, him asking why there is no practice for the Daytona 500 before qualifying takes place. I think that's a very, very good point from Denny Hamlin. That's one thing I really don't understand completely. Why is there no practice before the Daytona 500 qualifying? You would think that, especially with a lot of cars and some drivers who don't have a lot of experience on super speedways, and with how many cars are trying to qualify this year with potentially a lot of drivers entering this year, you would think that NASCAR would be smart enough to give these drivers more opportunities and more opportunities to get some experience. But I don't understand completely why there is a lack of practice for the Daytona 500. I don't get why. When they announced the schedule and there was going to be no practice before Daytona 500 qualifying on Wednesday, I was just like, really? We're not going to give these guys any experience before? That doesn't make any sense. Especially for the biggest event. For me, personally, if you want my opinion, I think there should be at least one or even two practice sessions. Daytona 500 is the one weekend and the 1 week where they should 100% be getting as much practice as possible, even 4 or 5 practice sessions, because it's the Daytona 500. You want to give these open teams an opportunity and a chance. And I just don't understand completely at all why they're not getting more opportunities, have some practice, and getting more experience. I just find that very, very frustrating, and I 100% agree with Denny Hamlin in a pretty big way that there should be practice before Daytona 500 qualifying. That's really, really frustrating, and it's really, really irritating that that is the case. It's disappointing for sure it's not happening, and I agree with Denny Hamlin 100% that there should be more practice and qualifying for sure before the Daytona 500. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Trevor Bayne. Now, it was reported by Bob Pockrass yesterday that Trevor Bayne is still working on his 2023 plans. Now, one of the biggest reasons why Trevor Bayne is not signed apparently is sponsorship. I thought that Trevor Bayne had sponsorship from Devotion Nutrition, but Trevor Bayne is still working on his 2023 plans. Trevor Bayne absolutely deserves an opportunity to drive that 19 car. Now, we'll talk about some of the drivers in the 19 car here in just a little bit. But Trevor Bayne, in my opinion, should be full-time with Joe Gibbs Racing right now. He performed admirably with Joe Gibbs Racing, which a lot of people did not expect him to perform really, really good. But he did a very good job with Joe Gibbs Racing last year. Contended for victories, got a couple finishes in the top 5, got a couple runner-up finishes last year. Then got a runner-up finish at Nashville. Then got a runner-up finish at a couple other races last year. And Trevor Bayne, in general, performed very, very well in that 18 car and came close to winning a few times. So I do understand why people are frustrated. I think he should be full-time in Xfinity right now. And the fact that he's not full-time in Xfinity is really, really disappointing. And I do not agree that he's not full-time in Xfinity right now. Because, like I said, he should 100% be full-time in Xfinity at the moment. And the fact that he's not, I think, is really, really disappointing and really frustrating to see. So I hope Trevor Bayne gets an opportunity to run this year because I think he deserves an opportunity. And I hope he does get an opportunity to race. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about the Hale Mellon car. Now, a couple days ago, and basically from a lot of the rules NASCAR announced, NASCAR has basically gone and banned the Hale Mellon rule at Martinsville in every single track. Meaning if you try to pull the move that Ross Chastain pulled, you're going to get penalized. Now, Trackhouse Racing basically announced that they are going to be keeping the Ross Chastain Hale Mellon car, and it will be preserved by the Trackhouse organization. This is really, really amazing to see that they're going to be preserving that car. The car still looks the same from the images and photos that we've seen. They look the same, which I think looks absolutely amazing that they're going to be keeping the Hale Mellon car around. I think there's a way that they'll keep it around. I think it needs 100% go into the NASCAR Hall of Fame as an exhibit because that move is the greatest move. One of the greatest NASCAR moves we've ever seen, if not the greatest move we've ever seen from any driver in the history of NASCAR. So I think in general, I love that they're doing this, preserving the car. I think that if Ross Chastain does get into NASCAR Hall of Fame, I think everyone will be talking about the Hale Mellon move and all the chaos that Ross Chastain has brought into the sport. But I am excited to see that they're going to be keeping the Hale Mellon car, not making any changes to it, and I'm glad to see that they're going to be preserving the Ross Chastain Hale Mellon car, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Connor Mosack. As it was announced yesterday that Connor Mosack is going to drive the 19 car for Joe Gibbs Racing for 3 races in 2023. Those races are the 3 road course races. I think it's Chicago, Portland, and Sonoma. Connor Mosack is also going to compete in 6 ARCA races for Joe Gibbs Racing in the number 18 car in 2023. Connor Mosack is a very talented up-and-coming driver. He ran very well in his select starts in Xfinity last year. Was pretty good in that 26 car. And at one point was leading the Portland Xfinity Series race for Joe Gibbs Racing in the 18 car. I think Connor will do a very solid job. I think he will be a threat to win races. And like I said, I'm very happy to see that Connor Mosack is going to be driving the 19 car for select races. I do think in the long-term future he will go full-time, or whether it's with Sam Hunt Racing, because he's going to, of course, run 20 races as well with Sam Hunt Racing this year. So he's going to be running nearly the full season. I think he's running 23 races in Xfinity this year. So while he's not going to be running the full season this year, he's going to be running nearly the full season. And I think Connor Mosack will have a very good year in 2023 and be very, very competitive. So I'm glad to see that Connor Mosack's getting an opportunity to drive the car, driving 20 races while with Sam Hunt Racing in the number 24 car. I'm glad to see that he'll be running in 2023, and I think he could have a very strong year with the team in 2023, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Joe Graf Jr. As it was announced yesterday that Joe Graf Jr. will drive the 19 for Joe Gibbs Racing in the NASCAR Xfinity Series for 5 races. Joe Graf Jr. will compete for the full season in 2023 as he also run the 28 races in the number 38 car for RSS Racing. Look, I want to say this. I like Joe Graf Jr. as a person. From everybody I've heard, he's a really nice guy. Joe Graf Jr., though, is not a great driver, if you want my honest opinion. He has not performed admirably. Now, he did get a top 10 last year, and if it was a RSS Racing, it gives me a little bit more confidence. But he's had opportunities in the past to drive for top-tier teams. Back in 2019, drove for RCR in the 21 car. D&Q one of the races and finished no better than 14th. Had another opportunity with Call Racing in the 10 car. Guess what he did? He DQ'd. He got D&Q'd. So he is D&Q'd with a Call car and a Rich Choice Racing car. And in 2019, Rich Choice Racing won the championship with Tyler Reddick. So I just don't completely understand in any shape or form why in the world is he getting this opportunity? He hasn't performed. Look, I think there's a big reason and factor for it, though, is because Joe Gibbs needs sponsorship funding. And Joe Graf Jr. has bucked off in other partners that are partnering with him this year, which is one big reason why he's getting an opportunity to drive for the team. I'm not expecting much from Joe Graf this year. Hope he proves me wrong and can perform well, because if he does, I'll shut my mouth. But I'm not expecting him to perform. I just don't think he's going to do really, really good next year. I'm not expecting him to have a really good year in 2023. And I don't think he has a great year with the team. He could prove me wrong, and I would love for him to prove me wrong because, again, I've not been impressed with Joe Graf Jr., but I'm not expecting Joe Graf Jr. to really set the world on fire in the 2023 season. Not expecting much, and I think he'll struggle with Joe Gibbs Racing. I think it's one top 10, and I think he finished outside the top 15 in the race he runs with Joe Gibbs Racing. I mean, it's a good opportunity, I guess, but I'm not expecting him to set the world on fire in the 2023 NASCAR Xfinity Series season. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about the Money Team Racing. Now, it was reported by Bob Pockets yesterday that the Money Team Racing is actually going to enter the 2023 Daytona 500. Now, initially, Julio Cashnebus was likely going to be the driver of the Money Team organization, but things have changed as Julio confirmed he will not run the 2023 Daytona 500. Connor Daly, though, is right now a rumored driver that could drive the car. In fact, I think that's likely who is going to be the driver. We heard from Adam Stern recently that they're trying to strike a deal to get him into the Daytona 500 as a big possibility. Nathan Brand also reported on that. They're trying to get him as a possibility. It's good to see, though, the money team is going to be entering the 2023 Daytona 500, though, which means we will have 42 confirmed entries for the Daytona 500, and we will have a couple cars going home. It could be competitive cars going home as well. And also, there still is possibility of a couple other teams showing up. Team Haysburg could still show up, and also NY Racing, which I didn't know they were still around until recently, but NY Racing could also show up. So if those two teams show up with drivers, you could have 8 cars competing for 4 spots and 4 cars going home. The duels are going to be more intriguing in 2023 regardless, and I am getting excited to see that we're going to see multiple teams trying to compete and get into the field for the Daytona 500. Daytona 500 qualifying is going to be important, and the duels are going to be important in a couple Thursdays from now, which we're not that far away from the Daytona 500. We're only about 2 weeks away from that, and we still don't know what the number Zane Smith's going to run. So the open entries, of course, are the money team, the 50 team, Jimmy Johnson, 84 for Legacy Motor Club, Travis Strong in 67, Black Rifle Coffee Toyota. You're going to have Zane Smith in a car, Austin Hill in the 62 Bennett Family Company, which will run 5 or 6 races with that team. You also will have Chandler Smith in the 13 as well, and potentially a couple other teams showing up in the 2023 Daytona 500. Really excited to see that the money team is going to be entering the 2023 Daytona 500, and my prediction right now is that it will be Connor Daly who will drive that car in the 2023 Daytona 500. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the first of 3 major stories in today's episode as we are talking about charters. Now, we kind of talked about this on the channel a couple days ago, but I want to give a shout out to Austin Kanensky reporting on this, that the teams want charters to be permanent. In addition to that, Adam Stern added on this last night that there are some ideas for the charter system. Ideas include spending cap tax system, that if a team goes over spending cap, because teams want a spending cap, that if they go over that tax cap, there could be money penalties. More unified sponsorships, and also potentially retirement pensions. Now, let me give you my opinion on the charter system in general. Let's begin with the charters. I am not the biggest fan of the charter system in general, and if I had to choose, I would get rid of the charter system completely. But the charter system is not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And the fact that the teams want the charter system to be permanent from the RTA will say that the teams want to keep it around. And there is at least some good intentions with the charter system. Basically, if you get rid of a charter, you do have assets to back up, and you can sell and make a lot of money to another organization. But there also are issues because the charter systems cost a ton of money. But if you want, for me, a proposition, we give more charters out. We go from 36 charters to 40 charters, and we also expand the field from 40 cars to 43 cars because you have a lot of teams that want to come in. Junior Motorsports wants to come in. Nice Motorsports has shown interest for Cup rides. The money team, I think, wants to get a charter. 2311, they want to expand their team to get a third charter. We know Trackhouse has a third car. They probably want to make that Project 91 car a full-time chartered entry. But let's get to the other side of things, which is the spending cap. I think a spending cap would actually be a pretty good thing, how much teams are allowed to spend in certain areas, because I think that would in general be a really good thing. It would probably equal the field a little bit. Also, more unified sponsorship, yeah, I think would be definitely okay with that. And retirement pensions would definitely be interesting for sure overall for the sport long term. But going back to the charter system, there are some positives with it and also some negatives with it. It will likely stay around regardless, and it'll probably be around for the next 10 years, but there definitely needs to be a way for charters also to be cheaper. Though they've been increasing. We know charters are around $30 million, and they continue to get more and more expensive because just last year, 2021, when Denny Hamlin bought his team, bought the charters, the second charter, I think it was, $13.4 million. He got it from Starcom Racing. Now charters are costing around $30 million, which is going to hurt teams coming in. They need to make charters a little bit more cheaper, in my honest opinion, because if they can do that, I think in general it will be really, really good for the sport, and we'll have to wait and see what happens in regards to that. But it sounds like they're going to try to make charter system permanent, and we'll see how that ends up going for NASCAR in general, in my opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next major story of today's episode as we are talking about Rockingham Speedway. Now, it was reported by Brett Baldeck yesterday that NASCAR has apparently had brief conversations about returning to Rockingham Speedway or vice versa the other way around. Rockingham's had conversations with NASCAR about returning maybe in the not-so-distant future, and the ball is in NASCAR's court. Now, apparently, they're also trying to get the Cars Tour to return to the track in 2024. This is not the first thing we've heard talk about potentially Rockingham returning, as we heard about it, I think last year in the middle of the year, they've been trying to return to NASCAR. Now, the last time that Rockingham was on the NASCAR schedule was in 2013 for the Camping World Truck Series, which is now, of course, the Craftsman Truck Series. Back in 2013, Kyle Larson won the last event. They brought it back for a couple of years, but the last time the Cup Series ran on Rockingham Speedway was back in 2004. We had the classic and great photo finish between Casey Kane and Matt Kenseth, and also Jamie McMurray was right there as well. One of the reasons that racing has really not happened much recently at the racetrack was because of the fact that quintessentially they weren't having the greatest attendance. But attendance was not the biggest problem, because at the end, when they came back, they had some pretty solid attendance when they did return to the racetrack. Going back and talking about Rockingham Speedway, we've been seeing some sort of a resurgence of short tracks coming on the schedule. Auto Club is expected to become a short track here in the not-so-distant future. Also, you have the big possibility of North Wilkesboro, which North Wilkesboro, of course, is returning for the All-Star Race in 2023. And you also have the talk about National Fairgrounds coming back, and with the mufflers coming into play, it sounds like there's a better chance of that coming back as well. And then finally, of course, now you have the possibility of Rockingham coming back. Personally, I want Rockingham Speedway to come back in a really, really big way. If you want my opinion on how you can incorporate Rockingham back on the schedule, you bring it back for the All-Star Race in 2024. I know people will say, well, their attendance wasn't great, and there's a lot of short tracks in the North Carolina area that are close together. And that's a fair point, because you have North Wilkesboro really close together. You've got Rockingham right there. You've got Charlotte. You've got Bristol not far away. So there are a lot of short tracks close, and that's one thing that goes against the possibility of Rockingham returning. But personally, I think that they need to return to Rockingham Speedway. Rockingham Speedway, of course, is a track that's legendary, hosted NASCAR races for a very, very long time. It's a shame they're not there right now on the track, and they want to come back. The people who own Rockingham have been trying to get it back. They're repaving the track because they've had issues with tires and all that kind of stuff. They're trying to get the track repaved. They're trying to get everything resurfaced around the track, and they're trying to return. And like I said already, I want to see this track return really, really badly, because I think it would be really good for sport in general, bringing another short track back, because it would also go back to the old school roots as well of NASCAR, because NASCAR is trying to get back to be more of the track where they do support the old school style of racing. They're trying to be new school, but also at the same time being old school types of stuff, bringing tracks like North Wilkesboro, potentially National Fairgrounds, and also potentially bringing a track like Rockingham Speedway back. I really hope it does happen, because like I've already said here, it would be massive and huge for the sport if a track like Rockingham can make a return to NASCAR. Now, you'd have to take a date from somebody, and I would think it would either go to maybe take one of the Kansas dates, which Kansas, of course, they host 2 dates at the moment, and this is no disrespect to Kansas, but Kansas does not, in my opinion, deserve 2 dates. I know the racing from last year made it deserve 2 dates, but when you look at the attendance for Kansas, the attendance was absolutely horrendous, and it would make a lot more sense to basically take that Kansas date, the spring date from Kansas, where you would have Rockingham, then the All-Star Race in North Wilkesboro, and then be in the Charlotte area. You would have like a month of Charlotte quintessentially, where you're in that area during that time. You move that to that point, and you have it all there like the North Carolina month in May. To me, Rockingham needs to return to the schedule, and that's just my opinion. I hope it does return in 2023, and we'll see what happens when it comes to Rockingham, but hopefully it can return in 2024. I don't know if it'll return in 2024, but there's a possibility NASCAR might be, in the not-so-distant future, returning to Rockingham Speedway. And now we'll go ahead and jump on to the final major story of today's episode, as we're talking about Christopher Bell. Now, Christopher Bell was basically on David Gravel's live streams. Over the last few months, David Gravel's had live streams on his channel and has brought in some top-tier drivers, including Kyle Larson as well. He had Christopher Bell on the channel for basically a Q&A session, also answering questions from the chat. He does this like every time he does his streams. And about the 59-minute mark in the live stream, Christopher Bell was asked, I believe by David Gravel, about why he did not run the Chili Bowl in 2023. And the reason being is because a lot of drivers did not compete in the Chili Bowl, and a lot of it was due to the purse money, especially with Kyle Larson. That does not seem to be the case so for Christopher Bell. Christopher Bell basically says that Joe Gibbs will not allow him to run dirt races because he had a connection with Coy, and unfortunately with Coy passing away, he said he lost that connection with basically going out and being able to run dirt races, because Christopher Bell has said publicly, and he said it on the stream, that Joe Gibbs apparently, he didn't say he hates dirt racing, but he's a not big fan of dirt racing overall in general. Now, there are two sides of the coin when it comes to this, but I have a more side that I'm on. First, the first side is where, again, being against dirt racing. There is a thing when it comes to this where I understand what Joe Gibbs is against Christopher Bell running dirt races. He wants to protect his assets. He doesn't want these drivers going to dirt races and getting injured. Because the safety in dirt racing, while it's definitely improved over the last couple of years, dirt racing itself is still not as safe as a NASCAR Cup Series car. But you have to think about this. The NASCAR Cup Series cars weren't really that safe last year with the back, and you can get concussions. And even Kyle Larson said at one point last year that the dirt cars were safer than the NASCAR Cup Series cars. I remember him saying that last year, back I think in September or back in October, if I'm not mistaken. He said that. Now, they worked on a fixed in action car, which is a really, really good thing. But at the same token, you had that as an issue. But then you go to the other side of stuff where I think personally, it's really kind of sad that Joe Gibbs will not let him race. But I think it is an issue with the old guard of owners. A lot of the old guard of owners, people like Rick Hendrick, Roger Penske, Richard Childress in points before recently, and then of course Joe Gibbs, they're not big fans of their drivers going out and running different forms of racing. Look at Rick Hendrick, for example. Rick Hendrick, for a long time, would not let his drivers go out and run different events. That all changed when Kyle Larson came in, and I think proof was in the pudding. Look at Kyle Larson in 2021. Kyle Larson in 2021 was allowed to run as many dirt races as possible, was allowed to run as much as he wanted, basically was allowed to run as much as he wanted to, and then he went on to win a lot of dirt races, but also went on to win 10 Cup Series races and won the championship that year. But then you get to the other side of the coin with Kyle Busch, of course, drove for Joe Gibbs Racing until this season. Kyle Busch was not allowed to run the Indy 500 in 2017. I think that was the year he was going to run the Indy 500, but Joe Gibbs completely denied that, had a deal done, and denied him from running the 2018 Indianapolis 500 while he had a deal ready to go and set in stone to run the Indy 500. And of course, he's not running it this year, but of course, he was not allowed to run. So Joe Gibbs, because again, IndyCar is not as safe as a NASCAR Cup Series car, though they have made huge improvements in the safety aspect of IndyCar over the last couple of years, aka the Halo system that they've brought in. And I think you look at Kyle Busch, his performance over the last years of Joe Gibbs Racing declined because of the lack of being able to go out and run whatever series he wanted to, but also not having the limits of having no practice on track. And I think that if you give these guys more opportunity to race, the more they would become improvement. But here's another thing that you talk about is the future, Chris, about at Joe Gibbs Racing. That's one thing to watch is how much longer is Christopher Bell going to want to stick around at Joe Gibbs Racing? Because if you watch the video and the body language from the video, he was very unhappy. Now, I don't see Christopher Bell leaving at least for the foreseeable future, at least the year or two. I don't see him leaving at the end of this year. He did sign a long-term deal, but that was before, unfortunately, what ended up happening in November. And I don't know how much longer Bell's going to want to stick around at JGR, but Joe Gibbs needs to, in the future, let Christopher Bell run dirt races. Otherwise, I think he will leave Joe Gibbs Racing. I understand it's a top ride and you want to be fast, but I'm not sure Joe Gibbs Racing this year in particular is going to perform very, very well. I'm worried about that team going this year, that I don't know if they are going to perform very well going into season. So I'm a little worried about that because they can't afford to lose drivers. Mark Truex Jr. might retire at the end of the year. Denny Hamlin also starting to get up there in age. Denny Hamlin is going to be 43 at the end of the year. And Denny is unclear if he's returning, though I do think likely he's going to return. You don't want to lose Christopher Bell when he's the best guy you have right now at the moment, because I think Christopher Bell is going to be the leader of Joe Gibbs Racing this year. He's going to be the best performer at Joe Gibbs Racing, and the best chance that Joe Gibbs Racing really has at winning a NASCAR Cup Series championship in 2023. That being said, though, I hope they can change Joe Gibbs. Like I said, they need to change their minds in the future. There needs to be a change of mind because they're going to continue to lose drivers. I think if Christopher Bell leaves Joe Gibbs Racing, because right now they're a top team, if he leaves Joe Gibbs Racing in the future, it's going to be because of this. Not being allowed to run dirt races. And I think he wants to run dirt races. He's got his own dirt team. He wants to run dirt. He wants to run it. He would have ran the Chili Bowl this year if he was allowed to run. But things changed, unfortunately, as of recently. And like I said, it is very disappointing here. He's not allowed to run the Chili Bowl because it would have been cool to see him run or run dirt racing in general. I know it's not as safe. But still, man, just let him run dirt. I really want to see him run because you're going to get the best version of Christopher Bell. I think if you gave him the opportunity to run more races, he performed best and you get the best Christopher Bell that you could get. but that's just my honest opinion on that. So, that is it for today's NASCAR news and motorsports news video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe, but channel notifications on so be notified when a video does go live on my channel. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as per my Patreon as well. Links are below over that, and comment below your thoughts below on today's episode. What are your thoughts about the situation of Cristobal not being allowed to run dirt races? Let me know in the comments below. And what are your thoughts about all the other stories we discussed here today on the channel, including the story about Rockingham? Let me know in the comments below. Tomorrow on my channel, I'm not entirely sure what's going to be on the channel. It could be a paint scheme video. We'll have to wait and see. Also, of course, we'll have reactions to qualifying after that is completed Saturday evening. And then Sunday, of course, we may have 2 videos on the channel, but probably 1. If I do 2, it'll be reactions to the heats. And also, I'll do the race review for the LA Coliseum race. So anyway, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's episode. And I'll see you guys next time for some more great, awesome NASCAR content and other motorsports content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.